Thank you, Sweli, and thank you for inviting me to be here. This is really a pleasure to be back at the chamber, particularly with the two brilliant colleagues and friends like the ones that we have today. And I'd like to echo your words and the chambers on what's happened last Sunday in Brazil, and make the same wishes about the due resolution and in fact, unrooting definitely this kind of radicalism. But I know as well that Sueli, you will have a discussion on Brazil next week, and we should focus today on exactly what has been proposed, the U.S. and global economy outlook, right? Particularly the question of whether the global economy and or the U.S. are marching towards a hard or a soft landing this year. After all, we have had, let's say, in course a process of monetary tightening, of a fight against inflation, which seems to be considered temporary, and now it has been recognized that more durable explanatory factors were there behind the surge of inflation last year. The shocks, initially the super shocks, but combined with, let's say, an overheated demand. And now we have been watching the adjustment, not so gradual, by the Federal Reserve, but also in Europe and so on. And we have here with us two fantastic persons for this discussion. Marcelo Estevão is the Global Director of the World Bank Group's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice. And he leads in this position a large team of country economists, macroeconomists, and fiscal policy, debt, and macro modeling experts. This is one intersection in our careers, as I also had in the past a time as one of the vice presidents of the World Bank dealing exactly with those issues. But Marcelo has a brilliant trajectory before that. Before joining the bank, he was Deputy Minister for International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance in Brazil and served as Brazil's G20 deputy. And again, this is another intersection because I have the honor of having been a predecessor of his in this position. But he also served as the chairman of the board of directors of the New Development Bank. And before that, he worked at Tudor Investment Corporation. And also he had the previous stint at the International Monetary Fund. Again, I also have in common with him on this in this regard. And also have John Welch, who's currently CEO of Research for Emerging Markets. And prior to that, he was executive director at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce in New York. And John has a stellar career at several financial institutions as chief economist for Latin America for HSBC. He also was at CIBC, Macquarie Capital, West LB, Barclays Capital, and BNP Paribas. And before Wall Street, he served as a senior economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. So also he has this in common with Marcelo, because Marcelo also had a time at the Federal Reserve System. So let's say, as I said, we had signs that the inflation is going down to some extent, even at a faster pace than many expected, but still labor markets on both sides of the Atlantic remain tight. We had last week here in the US, the jobs report showing that at least the pace of job creation has slowed down a bit. But the economy is still in good footing with the unemployment rate down to 3.5%. And the Fed, the FONC, the Open Market Committee minutes of the last meeting came clearly with a pushback against any expectations that we will have any easing of monetary policy in 2023. So we're moving down, and the inflation figures in Europe also surprised favorably in the sense that it is clearly heading down. But on both sides of the Atlantic, and that includes as well the case of the UK, it's looming there the question on whether the growth deceleration following the monetary tightening and financial conditions tightening will be, let's say, end up on a sort of soft landing or a harder landing, or whether even if that will be accompanied by some sort of financial turbulence in markets and so on. So let me ask them, starting with Marcelo, to, let's say, to make some points about how he views the evolution of the global economy, and with both sides of the Atlantic, and besides, to some extent as well, Japan, on are we heading towards a soft landing, a hard landing, or else? And later on, we'll have the chance to address the other members of the global economy, including China and emerging markets and developing economies. So let me start with Marcelo. Marcelo, go on.
Thanks so much, Otaviano. Thanks so much for the invitation. And as a good Brazilian, I'm going to just respect a little bit the rules that Otaviano just set up by saying that I think I will talk first about the global economy as a whole. Then I think for the Q&A, I'll talk a little bit more about are we going to have a soft landing or not. So basically, what I would like to talk is about our baseline forecast. Just came out as part of the broad macro group at the World Bank. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we should do to do better in terms of growth. We are not very optimistic about 2023, even though when we talk about the US per se, and I think I'll leave that for the Q&A, you see that I'm actually quite pleased about how policy has been evolving from the side of the Federal Reserve so far, and actually surprised on how successful they have been on, at least that's what looks in the data right now, on producing a soft landing. But anyway, so let me start with our views on the near-term growth prospects for the whole globe, okay, instead of focus on the particular countries. We are forecasting a global growth of 1.7% in 2023. That's 1.3 percentage points lower than our June forecast. This is a very weak performance. Only in 2009 and 2020, during the global financial crisis and the pandemic, the economy performed below this level over the last 3 decades. So it's like the third worst year in the last 3 decades for the world economy as a whole. Growth projections have been downgraded for almost all advanced economies. They are expected to grow at a mere 0.5% in 2023, down from 2.5% in 2022. This sizable growth slowdown reflects policy tightening to tame high inflation, worsening financial conditions, and continued trade and investment disruptions stemming from the absurd and violent invasion of the Russian Federation of the Ukraine. Now, emerging markets and developing economies are also facing a multi-year period of slow growth, and that's driven by several mutually reinforcing factors. And that's the part that I'm going to talk a little bit more about emerging markets and developing economies now before I talk about the US. First, the pronounced weakness in the world's 3 main engines of growth, the United States, the Euro area, and China, is softening export demand and investment, particularly for emerging market developing economies. Second, despite the softening of prices across many commodities, say food and energy, there has been a softening after the big increase in the beginning of the 2022 and the first half. But prices remain above historical averages, which drains resources in commodity imported countries. Third, the needed tightening of monetary policy and debt distress is fueling capital outflows in many emerging market and developed economies, not all, and we can come back to that in a Q&A, which limits financing access and trigger, in some cases, a balance of payment crisis, all in the context of already a non-existent macroeconomic space to react. So that's why I'm focused on this part of the world, emerging market developing economies, because I think they are in a particular fragile situation, even though there are lots of bright spots. But what does this mean? This means that per capita income will not recover to its 2019 levels until at least 2024 in about 1/3 of emerging market and developing economies. It's quite serious. An estimated 7% of the world's population would still be in extreme poverty by 2030. Simultaneously, if not addressed, climate change can push up to 130 million people into poverty over the next 10 years. And looking at poverty more broadly, over 3 billion people live on less than $6.85 per day today, which reflects the typical national poverty line of upper middle income countries. Thus, there's not only a risk of global recession in the near term, but again, I come from the World Bank, so that's why I want to send this message now, right at the beginning, but also potentially a lost decade. So the question is, what actions should policymakers take to avoid this protracted global economic slump that may go beyond 2023? Again, not a global recession, just very low growth. Easy recipes rely on carry trade or external demand booms in some sectors are not there. I mean, there are no easy recipes. Growth will require hard work to reignite productivity. So the precondition will be sound macroeconomic policies, and a lot of what we are going to be discussing soon is about that, about how to deal with different maybe scenarios for the US economy or for Europe and Japan. But much more needs to be done. So actions to address climate and development as one present an important opportunity. For example, investment in infrastructure to enhance energy, transport, and housing efficiency and resilience. Investment in the energy transition will also play a role, and all this can be seen also as somewhat of a cyclical support for economies that have a fiscal space to help to bring the private sector in when they are implementing this type of programs. So we have done quite a bit of research on climate, and we find that on average, developing economies, we need to invest the equivalent of 1.4% of their GDP until 2030 to build resilience to climate change and get on track to reduce emissions by 70% by 2050. And this will be possible only with scaled up financing, including from developed economies. I know this is long term, and we are talking about what's happening right now. But one thing that we learned actually during COVID, the recession there, is when governments tried to do counter-cyclical policy, they went full brown. So, but they can go full green, or they should aim to do that as they deal with the slowdown that we are going to see in 2023. So I could talk about sector regulatory reforms if you go into this broader, more long-term view on the global economy. Investment in education will be key here. The backslide in long-term productivity, in this long-term productivity enhancer during COVID has been massive. So there's lots to be done on education and investment to enhance agricultural productivity and all this good stuff that is good for the long term. Now is the time to have that debate. I just want to say now, just to close, and then I promise to talk about the US in the second round, that is in the context of these high interest rates in the world, growth and productivity will require a lot of work and political consensus at the country level. So now I'm going to join my voice to Ottaviano and to Sueli of reflect on what's happening in Brazil. It's not the time, certainly not now, to have this type of conflict and social strife that is made up by basically some disturbed ideological positions about what's happening in the world. Now is the time to talk about how we can teach our children better, how we can recover the productivity loss that we got, how we can get these economies, and Brazil is one of them, but in the Q&A I can go further on that, has not done badly compared to some other emerging market countries, in particular in 2022. Now is the time to be productive. So what happened in Brazil is really more than a scandal. It's almost like a sin in a world that needs people to actually do the right thing and not be invading policies in Congress. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Marcelo. John, please.
Thank you, Otaviano, and thank you, Sueli and Marcelo, for having me on your great panel. I won't speak about Brazil, at least the politics about Brazil. I'll speak about economics maybe later. But I do want to focus more on the United States. As you can see, I have a picture of my former employer. I was never at the board. I was always west of the Mississippi, unlike Marcelo. I suppose you were at the board, right, Marcelo?
Yep.
So west of the Mississippi, you have this huge resentment of the Beltway. So I have that ingrained into me. But it was, it's been very disappointing watching the Fed over the last 3 or 4 years. I do think they're on a very good track right now. They've realized, I think we're all about the same age, Marcelo, Otaviano. I spent my whole graduate years, other than looking at inflation in Latin America, looking at the inflation of the 1970s as I watched it, rates going up in the United States and it finally coming down. And I remember 2 years ago hearing, oh, this is transitory. Oh, it's not going to be the 1970s all over again. And I was like, there's something, and I'll talk about this in a bit. There's something quite a bit different and worse than the 1970s. We've never had fiscal expansion like this in the United States. So I'm going to talk first, I'll go back to talking globally, and then I'll come back to something about the fiscal side. Globally, all the countries have gone through almost exactly the same pattern of GDP. And you have a lot of linear projections, and even in places like the Fed and multilaterals, for that matter, really got the GDP numbers wrong. But it's astounding to me because Otaviano, myself, and Marcelo have lived through things that were just completely external shocks. And this was an external shock, completely external. And what happens? You get a big drop in GDP, and then it recovers very quickly. It's we call it the rubber band effect. The harder you pull down on the rubber band, the faster it comes back, but then it overshoots. So you would expect on the other side of this rubber band effect some negative quarters. I don't see a recession going on right now. That doesn't mean I don't expect one in the future, but I think it'll be policy induced. The question is will the policymakers induce it? And that's the hardest part about this thing. So I'm not at all surprised about these negative quarterly growth rates that we've seen in the United States. We haven't gotten the fourth quarter yet. We've seen a couple of those in a couple of European countries, but this is just the other side of the massive acceleration that you had going the other side. Wait, now the question is, what do we do? Certainly, monetary accommodation in almost all the G7 countries was entirely too big, and now they're entirely too late tightening up. The Fed is the least late between the BCE and the BOE. Certainly negative right now. The policy rate is looking at exposed is about a negative 2.5%. The other central bank real interest rates are lower than that. So, and then if we look at monetary conditions indexes, there's nothing that looks tight at all still, even with this. So my way I describe what's going on with the central banks, they're less loose, but they're certainly not tight yet. What is very good about, especially Powell's statements, and I'll look at fiscal policy in just a moment, is that he is saying we don't want to reproduce the 1970s because what they happened in the middle of the 1970s, inflation started coming down, the Fed eased, and then we were right back up there again, and then we had to have the true hard landing from Volcker induced, and we were headed towards that, I think, in my own opinion. Was my view. But the fact that they are not flinching, even though we're getting better numbers right now, I think is a very good thing. With a small note, Brazil is one of the best central banks in all of this. They tightened early. They did not hurt the recovery, and they really got back a lot of credibility, or they used the credibility they had in the correct way by confirming it. The Fed, I got to the Fed when they finally had credibility again, and the credibility really was hurt by all of this. And if you don't have credibility, it doesn't matter what you promise. We're going to keep rates up there until you prove it. Then people don't believe you. So that means typically higher inflation expectations, prices start going up and stuff like that. I'll just conclude my opening statements, and we see this pattern in other countries as well, except the U.S. fiscal stance is the loosest in history, including World War II. We had a very big fiscal expansion in World War II, but then a very fast recovery. We are still having primary deficits, total deficits on the order of 12% of GDP. Primary deficits have come down a little bit, but they're still extremely high. In fact, a year ago, right now, the American Economic Association meetings are going on. I was absolutely shocked to watch a panel where a Treasury economist was showing equilibrium primary deficits. And I'm like, what is that? I don't know. Typically, when you're looking at debt trajectories and sustainability, you pay off your debt with primary surpluses. You can't have an equilibrium primary deficit. And the only way that that could possibly happen is if real interest rates remain below real growth forever, which is also something that doesn't happen. Real interest rates are always above growth, and it's not Pareto efficient. Because if it is that way, then we can continuously borrow from our grandchildren to consume today, and that makes absolutely no sense. So I was absolutely shocked at this, and the projections coming out of the OMB are exactly the same, that we're going to have primary deficits into the late 2030s, which is not sustainable. And the credibility of macro policy will suffer. It's okay if you got the credibility of all the stuff that we don't always adjusted fiscal policy again afterward, and monetary policy always fought inflation. And we always went back to the good. And then we also had the help of demographics. So I'm still very alarmed about the fiscal side, more than the monetary side, because very clearly the signals we're getting are much better. Are we done yet? I don't think so. If they continue on this trajectory, we may have a soft landing. That's a tough one. Now I'll talk just quickly about the labor market, then I'll stop there and then I'll go back to other things on this later. But right now, we're still producing about 1.5 jobs we have 1.5 job openings for everybody unemployed. And the idea of the Fed is to somehow get those equal to each other, and that without affecting the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is very low. And as Octaviano said at the beginning, labor markets are very tight. That's a tough one because the Fed has never produced a soft landing like this ever in its history. I think I'm more sympathetic to Marcelo's view that maybe we'll have a soft recession. I certainly hope so. And I think the signs are quite good for that. But we still have negative real rates. We still have a Fed that's tightening. We still have monetary conditions that have not really tightened. And that makes for a difficult story. Just one note on demographics. People thought we'd have real interest rates low for a long time. Those will start turning around fairly soon, especially since our demographics were not exactly what people thought. The Social Security system is running primary deficits now in the United States. And the funds are projected to run out of their assets in 2033. In addition to that, demographics are a real phenomenon. They are not a nominal phenomenon. Why did we get the combination of low real rates and low inflation at the same time? It's because we have most of the central banks in the world adopted inflation targeting, and it was credible. That was kind of thrown out the window in the last couple of years, unfortunately. And it's going to take, there's so many analogies, right? One was it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube after you got it out, or it's hard to get the horse back in the corral. And I think we maybe, if we're lucky, and the Fed has gotten the horse just as it was just getting out of the corral. But I can only hope. But I do think I feel a little bit more comfortable about the inflation scenario in the United States and growth. Fiscal side, not so much. We stop there.
All right, good. We started to receive already a couple of interesting questions, but not to be dragged on simply on what we have discussed. Let me say just a couple of words of another missing block of this global picture that matters a lot, which is the case of China. China obviously was not facing the same kind of inflationary challenge as the rest of the world. Japan also faces its own challenge. But in the case of China last year, we had the surprise of growth rates quite below what was expected to be the new normal after the pandemic, in the sense that much lower than the 6%. The economic growth rates in China moved down to close to 3%, and that was due besides the impacts of extreme weather phenomenon like everybody else, but also the effects of the zero COVID policy and the exhaustion of the use of the real estate as a lever for growth. Now what? We had this abrupt change of stance with respect to the COVID, and rates of infections went to the roof. And fact is that it has been registered how the lower mobility is impacting, has impacted the fourth quarter of the Chinese economy. So one thing we know, definitely the economic growth rate of China this year may still disappoint those who might expect it coming to levels close to 4 or 5%. And this has implications, of course, for not only the emerging markets that today are growth dependent on China, but also on commodity price. So I wanted to include this as part of the picture that we're giving here. 5:30. So let me let's say, Marcelo, you want to say anything specifically on the US before we go on, or?
Yeah, let me just, because again, we just came out with our new forecast, so I was very tempted to basically ignore your, but I want to now back to the topic, since I was talking about broad issues. What I find remarkable, that was my throwaway argument, my throwaway comment, is I would not expect the US economy to be what it is right now. After, I mean, I'm quite surprised, positively surprised, about how much inflation has come down, and how much, I'm not surprised about the commitment of the Federal Reserve. I mean, I think that makes sense. That's what the board of, the FOMC had to do. And I do agree with John that that's credibility is fundamental. I think they kept the horse in the corral by what they did in the last year or so. I'm not sure the revision of the framework was the best thing to have done in the past. So moving toward the average inflation type of say, let's call it targeting. But that's, water on the bridge. You make a mistake, you correct the mistake, and they are doing that. So what we see is inflation decelerating, helped by declining international commodity price, but it's decelerating. We do see the labor market is still quite tight, like Ottaviano said. Some aspects of the labor market are slowing down. You look at different definitions of wage growth, they're always decelerating. We do see aspects from the labor demand side really decelerating as well. So the whole notion of a soft landing, that you do a good part of the adjustment through reducing excess labor demand, so there's less pressure on the market for the given amount of employed and unemployed people. So that's the hope. And we do see these things playing out, but I still find it hard to believe that you are able to converge completely to say a 2% inflation without having an unemployment rate at least above 4%. I mean, I would expect to be close to 5%, but so far we have an unemployment rate of 3.5%, and you have symptoms of loosening in the nominal part of the economy, both wages and prices, with a very strong labor market. So I'm just very surprised, but happy. I mean, maybe let's see what's going to happen. Anyway.
Great. Well, let me also then take the opportunity to ask you to relay a question asked by Thales Zakowski on what would you consider to be the odds of the inflation indeed decreasing to the 2% level? And by the way, as Marcelo said it, it's not the appropriate time to think of reviewing or revisiting the monetary policy regime that might send strong signals. Some economists had suggested to move the target to 3% and so on, and wisely members of the Fed, there's no time for this. That might contaminate process of adjustment. So, but I would like to have the views of both of you on what is the likelihood that we really move, if not to 2% in 2023, but close to that. And by the way, Thales also asked why whether the rates are going to be higher for longer. I let me say, making self-propaganda. Today, I released a policy brief from the Policy Center for the New South, which where I'm a senior, currently a senior fellow, in which I talk about a change in the macroeconomic policy regime in advanced economies, which includes a shift from, let's say, the pattern that we had before 2021, where the US economy was dealing with supposedly insufficiency of aggregate demand, low inflation, and low interest rates. And maybe a change of regime has taken place. That is to say, now we're going to live for some time with higher rates of inflation or tendentially higher rates of inflation, and inevitably higher rates of interest rates. And we have diversity of views. If you think of economists like some economists saying that the change is definitive, whereas if you think of Olivier Blanchard alluding to the possibility, to the hypothesis that after a period, we would go back to where we were. So do you guys have any view on this, on the speed of adjustment of inflation towards the 2% target, as well as on whether we change the macroeconomic policy regime for a considerable time or not? What are your views on this? John.
Okay, very good. Very good question. And if I get it right, I'll make, lots of money for somebody else, not me. But I do think the way they are approaching this by not worrying about immediate reductions in inflation is very important, because we've seen this come back. The market, I think, gets it ahead of its skis. It's done this about 5 times now, thinking the Fed was done. I don't really see how anyone could think they're done. But I do think, I completely agree with you and Marcel, that changing the target now would not make any sense. It wouldn't do anybody any good either. As long as you have a target that's low, it's good. And we had 20 years of mild deflation in the United States between the Civil War and the First World War. That was extraordinarily productive, and the same thing we've seen, especially if we look at per capita GDP. So I think you have to have some kind of rule, and the Taylor rule with inflation targeting is the most flexible rule that has rigidity to it, if you can follow it. The average, I completely agree with Marcel. When they brought out the average inflation target, I thought that was extremely naive, maybe. I don't know, because as all of us know, in Brazil, when inflation accelerates, the moving average stays behind. So it's really hard to say, which means you're going to have to get it down below the average at some point in the future for a more extended period. So it could actually exacerbate the volatility as opposed to improving the volatility situation. And certainly they did not estimate correctly where the inflation rate was going to go back to. So I do think that we are on that trend. I think the ECB is, and the BOE isn't that far behind, but the ECB is quite a bit behind. Is it a new regime, Ottaviano? I'm not sure. I think basically demographics is dictating things. It still portends lower real interest rates because the world is aging. But countries that never took care of their Social Security situation, or at least in modern history, haven't done that, like Brazil, for example, are going to have a very hard time if they don't do more reform and come. It's not only Brazil; it's mostly all of Latin America, and many of the countries are going backwards on those reforms. But the United States as well. We are now, because of wrong forecasts in terms of birth rates and immigration, we are not seeing the revenues that tax contributions on Social Security are not meeting benefits, and our beneficiary to contributor ratio is going to be going down continuously. And oddly enough, Latin America is, and especially Brazil, is aging at the same pace as China. So it is some years out, the big problems that they're going to take place. But this is the fiscal side is going to be the biggest challenge as far as I'm concerned. Monetary policy was a bit off, and I do think Marcelo is right. The credibility of the Fed will probably end up okay. But that means lower inflation is going to probably mean lower growth, not necessarily because of monetary policy, but because you're going to have a huge fiscal expansion pushing against the Fed, and that's not, and as we know in Brazil especially, that's not a good policy mix.
So let me go quickly on that. On your question, Otaviano, I think there's a lot of agreement here on inflation at 2%. I do see a chance of converging by 2024. I find it hard to believe that they are going to achieve 2% by the end of 2023. But again, there's lots of positives in the inflation dynamics. There is the dynamics of rent equivalent owner, the component in the CPI, and if you look at the components of PCE related to real estate, you do see some of these inflationary pressures there. So maybe you're going to get more, you're going to go faster to 2%, but I doubt it's going to reach 2% in 2023. I cannot find a path for that. So, and I think the Fed is going to keep the target. They're going to keep aiming. It's okay to miss the target for a year or two if the trajectory is in the right direction. I do not see any problem for credibility. On your point of real interest rates in the long run, I do think they're going to be higher. Yeah, I think we are in a different world, a world where there is a massive fiscal expansion in the U.S. There is a pressure, at least nominal interest rates in the short term will continue to be on the high side. Once inflation adjusts, I see a bit less pressure for that we've seen in the last 20 years for very low real rates or even negative. So I do see a shift in the regime. Say in the framework. Now there's a question here in the chat by Alex Pierantoni asking if it's possible to have some kind of decoupling between, say, Brazil and the US in the short term. Completely. I mean, the Brazilian central bank did an amazing job of tightening monetary policy at the right time. You saw inflation decelerating in Brazil before many countries in the world. And by the way, unemployment rate declined significantly for Brazilian standards. So the Brazilian central bank has peaked in terms of interest rates. It's going to begin probably loosening policy rates probably by the middle of next year. I may be wrong. I'm not in the business of doing exact predictions, but it's, the narrative is of a monetary cycle that is more advanced in Brazil. So you should expect more loosening before the Federal Reserve, and then you see economic activity picking up in Brazil probably before the US.
Yeah. Taking a ride on this, on your answer, Marcelo, let me ask both of you also the following. I don't know about you, but very often when I go to speak about emerging markets, I realize how there is a tendency out there to lump sum them together as if they were in the same thing, the same situation. And they all come with the question, well, interest rates are globally rising, so does that bode badly for all emerging markets and so on? Whereas clearly we have a heterogeneity of situations. On the one hand, you have the not only the low-income countries, but also some emerging markets, middle-income countries, facing a fragile situation in terms of finance, external finance and fiscal, that are deeply concerned with the rise of interest rates. But also you have a bunch of other emerging markets that, at least from the standpoint of balance of payments, that have performed quite well. People forget that this last year, for circumstantial reasons, of course, but the Mexican peso and the Brazilian real valued vis-a-vis the dollar, whereas the dollar was appreciating vis-a-vis all the other major advanced economies' currencies. So there is a heterogeneity of conditions that must be taken into account. Brazil has its own other sides, fiscal concerns and so on, but when it comes to balance of payments and the scenario outside, the concerns are much lower, I believe. Now, let me ask both of you as the following. We have spoken not much about Europe, but of course, the mix of supply side shocks and excess of demand was a bit different on the European side, with a higher weight to supply shocks, obviously, the energy prices and the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and so on. But inflation has come down, reasons for this: slow down of energy prices. The winter has been mild so far, and so on. How do you guys have an opinion on whether, at the same time, Europe has its own challenge? Everyone is concerned on how to deal with what's going to happen to the Italian debt as the interest rates go up by the European Central Bank. John said that the European Central Bank was, let's say, laggard vis-a-vis the adjustment in the US. So do you guys see any special perils or challenges on the European side as compared, for instance, to the US?
Well, I didn't comment on the Europe directly other than the ECB, but Marcelo did, and he put his finger right on the button, so to speak. I mean, the real question is, how is this going to resolve in the Ukraine? And, the question is then also, how quickly can European countries, especially Germany, adapt to a different energy regime, which it is. And it looks like they've taken that choice. They're going to try not to depend so much on Russian gas. But that's for a different economist than myself. I think on the other sides, you're right. Inflation has come down. Some of it is the sort of other side of the supply side part. And there was also other supply side shocks that Europe didn't completely undo as fast as, say, the United States, especially the sort of lockdowns, et cetera. And that will help some activity on that front. The growth rate in Europe is, just below 2%, I believe, and should do okay, even with the ECB tightening, because them tightening should not affect these things the way it didn't really affect Brazil in that sense. And people deciding to come back to work really isn't that interest rate sensitive. So I'm fairly optimistic about Europe. They're behind, I would say, the curve. They've had special circumstances. I think somehow the crisis with the Ukraine and Russia leaders have managed it well enough so that it didn't escalate into something worse, but it's always there, right? And England, UK has been a little bit faster at opening up and tightening, but they seem like they're following sort of the same script as the United States, just a little slower.
Okay, Marcelo, your take?
Yeah, I think I was actually quite pessimistic on Europe. I would say 6 months ago, 5 months ago. But I do see, so I would use the same arguments, but I think the intensity are less. I mean, the supply shocks, you answered, the supply shocks in Europe, Otaviano, were more severe, and they continue there. They're still there. The underlying supply bottleneck is still an issue. It's just prices, gas prices came down a bit, oil price came down a lot. The winter was not as bad. I mean, I had scenarios for, if you had a bad winter in Europe, all hell's going to break loose. That didn't happen. So, but that shows an underlying fragility and also the limitation of what the European Central Bank can do to control inflation. If you have that bottleneck, latent bottleneck there. So they need to solve that bottleneck. One hope, I don't think it's a hope, I think it's happening, that this higher oil and gas prices in the world are going to accelerate decarbonization in Europe, and that's going to accelerate their dependence on Russian supply, and that's actually good for the world in the long term. You're basically accelerating something that is important, that is decarbonization of economic activity in the world. So yeah, but still, I mean, the job of the Fed is somewhat easier, because if you look at all the indicators of supply bottlenecks in the United States have come down. I mean, supply deliveries and all. I mean, they look pretty normal now. While they look bad a year ago.
Yeah, even though, Marcelo, yes, you're perfect, right? I agree with you. We had an interesting question already asked by Marcelo Antonio, where he referred to, let's say, reading, interpreting what he's asking, a higher frequency of supply shocks. Of course, the degree, the intensity, the multiplicity of shocks since 2021 is unparalleled. The pandemic, the war, the invasion of Ukraine, but there may be ahead the continuity of some other source of supply shocks that were there before. Deglobalization, right? However relative it is, however limited it ends up being, the fact of the matter is that the trend, whatever it happens, will be cost-wise upward. The road to decarbonization that you referred to, one has to recognize that it will be good for mankind, but it will tend to be costly. It will, given the difference of efficiencies as of today, on average, of renewable energy vis-a-vis non-renewable, the substitution replacement will be costly in terms of increased price and the critical minerals and so on. So one may aptly say that if anything, the tendency in the next future will be of a higher prevalence of costs of supply side shocks, intensifying the idea of a regime change. Now, but let me also, taking the chance, we haven't spoken much about the financial sphere. One way or another, the long period of low interest rates, led to higher levels of leverage of the corporate sector. The response to the pandemic also took it to another degree, and so on. And more recently, we have seen some reports. The BIS, the latest BIS quarterly review, came with a strong warning about hidden sources of fragility, financial fragility to shocks. They referred to mortgage, but we also have had other reports talking about spots where illiquidity may generate shocks that will not tend to be coped well with by the current financial intermediaries. We also had the metamorphosis of financial intermediation, because the long time of low interest rates was accompanied by a shift out of banks in terms of intermediation, with the void being occupied to some extent by non-banking financial intermediations. And as the BIS highlighted quite well, not often those non-banking financial intermediaries are able to cope with the demand for liquefying assets and so on, which has led some even to think of the possibility that the Fed and the European Central Bank will have to combine their ongoing quantitative tightening with local interventions in segments of markets, as the Fed did in the time of the repos and so on. So, of course, Moody's comes in and says, well, look, there's not much of a mismatch between assets and liabilities of the corporate sector, but whereas some other analysts pinpoint this possibility of localized shocks of liquidity and so on. Do you have any concern in that regard?
I mean, we have been talking about inflation and growth and labor market, which are two aspects of, say, the Fed mandate. There's a third one, there is the financial stability mandate. And the Fed increased tremendously its staff that's dedicated. It created a new division at the Federal Reserve Board, and it has invested a lot on paying more attention on the financial stability mandate, which they dropped the ball during the, in the period preceding the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So I would say they are going to continue intervening punctually if these things happen. I'm not particularly concerned about financial stability in the US. I'm quite concerned about financial stability in Japan. We haven't talked about
Yes.
Japan.
Yeah, that's right.
Because again, it's an economy that has been operating basically with, let's call zero interest rate for 30 years. And now they do even like a curve, a curve control, on the fixed income space. Now, suddenly, inflation has come to Japan, and interest rates are going to have to go up. And I do get concerned that for an economy that has been so used to very low interest rates, what would be the implications of that? So my argument is, I don't know what's under the hood, but someone needs to be looking at it. So I think, the financial supervisors in Japan should be quite busy now.
Right. Marcelo, some people have even mentioned that we will increasingly move from the dilemma of central banks between inflation and unemployment to a trilemma: inflation, unemployment, and financial stability. Right, John, your take.
I know exactly what paper you're thinking about in the BIS. I think the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial. That paper is very flawed in that it double counts. It adds currency swaps to debt, but when in fact you have to net them. A person uses a swap to change the denomination of a debt. So it's not quite right. They add that on as extra leverage. And if we look worldwide, at basic measures of leverage, they're still the United States is very low. I'm not worried about financial stability in the United States, unlike in 2008, where we had massive leverage. We had a collapse in the leverage in the banking system and of corporations and of individuals, and only the corporate side has come back a little bit. And that's true in Latin America as a whole as well. Latin America is very under leveraged. Canada, a little bit more leverage, but they never had as many sort of incentives to do naughty things as the United States. So I'm not, and Europe is a little worrisome because they never completely cleaned out their bad assets from the 2008-2009 crisis. But they're okay as well. The leverage in Europe doesn't strike me as really a big problem. And that's the dynamite of these things. The only institutions that can create pure leverage are the banks. Yes, we have these shadow banking things and stuff like that. But if they give you a credit derivative, there's a bank behind it. And you just have to trace it around. Just to finalize, yes, Japan is a little bit worrisome, but I'm less worried about it because if you look at things in per capita terms, it doesn't look so bad. Their growth rates are the same as the United States. The problem is it's the denominator, right? But the country that's going to have a lot of problems with its denominator is China. So for the medium and long term, I'm quite worried about China because they are now getting towards U.S. dependency ratios, and they're going to go right through them very soon. At least they have somewhat of a financial market now, but when this all started, they had nothing. So there's the aging process in China is very, very fast.
Right.
It's at the speed of light. So that's a bigger structural problem that we're going to confront over the next 10 years.
Right. And also because what seemed to be taken for granted, that is to say, the permanence of a higher growth rates in China as compared to the rest of the world is no longer so much reassured.
No, it's going to go down.
Yeah, no, resorting to financial stimulus to housing and so on will no longer work. And so the Chinese economy is accommodating to a lower growth rate. We're running to the end, and but you guys have given us a very good picture of all aspects. And Marcelo, you were so right about Japan, that not even the yield curve control has been deemed to be bearable for long. We had an early signal of a move out, a couple of weeks ago, and so on, to be seen how far Japan will be able to move the policy regime to something else, right? Any final, since we're running against time, anything that you guys, in your view, would like to add to finalize?
I mean, I just want to say we haven't talked much about China. I think China is really the big elephant in the room in many ways. If you think of what happened in Japan in 2021, once they got out, Japan had very severe control of society as well to try to curb infection. Once they loosen, you had an increase in infection, was kind of bad, but then after they kind of normalized and economic activity recovered. China, I think, is probably going to be the same story. You're still going to have one quarter. This quarter probably is still weak. My view is that second, third, and fourth quarter of the year are going to see some kind of return to economic activity. If I'm wrong about that, then you're going to have worse growth rates. And I'm concerned about China in the long run as well, in terms of how much they can grow if they, anyway, that will go to geopolitics and what's happening in politics in China. Thanks.
Perfect. John?
I'll just say quickly on the markets. You asked me to say something about the markets, but I do think if I agree with Marcelo, I don't think inflation is going to hit 2% in 2023. The question for an investor is, when is the Fed going to stop raising rates? Right now, anyway. And the market has had some false signals. Like we've seen about 5 of these. Oh, it's done, and then it's not. Then it's done. It's going to get done sometime next year. And I think looking more at fixed income soon, not right now. I still think we've got a little ways to go. Is going to be good. And I think this is going to be good for some of the cyclical stocks on the equity side. And finally, I wanted to express my my sentiments to all Brazilians. I have had the benefit of having professors like Professor Octaviano. Now I know Marcelo and many others, and Sueli's, just really great Brazilians. And I know I always have faith that Brazil will work problems out, even when you have unfortunate events like we had last Sunday. So my prayers are all with you. So
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, John and Marcelo, for, I guess we covered a lot of ground despite the time limit and so on. And it's been a pleasure.